They said it was impossible. For decades, the International Monetary Fund has ruled over Africa's financial lifelines like an invisible empire deciding who eats, who starves, who rises, and who falls. When inflation hit, when currencies collapsed, there was always one answer: wait for Washington's permission. But then came the shock no one expected. In the crowded markets of Accra, Ghana's central bank refused to wait. Without a nod from the IMF, they began pouring precious US dollars into their own economy, defending their people, lifting the cedi, and buying time for survival. At the very same moment, in Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré tore up the script once and for all. By nationalizing the nation's gold mines, he declared, "We are not poor. We are being robbed." Two nations, one defiance. Ghana and Burkina Faso did what the experts swore could never be done. They took control of their own money, their own resources, and their own future without IMF approval. And suddenly, the mighty institution that has dictated Africa's destiny for half a century was left stunned, exposed, and scrambling. But here's the question the world now asks. Is this the beginning of Africa's financial revolution? Or is it the start of an even bigger showdown between sovereign nations and the global banking system? Because make no mistake, what just happened is not a minor act of rebellion. It is the spark of something far larger, far more dangerous to the old order. The possibility that Africa can write its own rules. So stay with me, because in the next few minutes we will uncover exactly how Ghana and Ibrahim Traoré shocked the IMF, why the world's financial elites are panicking, and what this could mean for the future of Africa and for the global system itself. The story begins not in Washington or Paris, but in the bustling streets of Accra. In early 2025, Ghana was staring into the abyss. Prices of food and fuel were spiraling. A bag of tomatoes that cost 10 cedis in December now demanded 20. Taxi drivers parked their cars because gasoline had doubled overnight. Teachers and nurses, once the backbone of society, were skipping meals to keep their families alive. Inflation was roaring past 35%, and the cedi, Ghana's national currency, was in free fall. For decades, the solution had always been the same call: the IMF begged for a bailout, accept the conditions, and tighten the belt of an already starving population. But this time something different happened. The Bank of Ghana decided it would no longer wait for permission. In a quiet but radical move, officials began releasing hundreds of millions of US dollars from Ghana's reserves into the market. The goal was simple: fight speculators, stabilize the cedi, and send a signal to the people that their government still had power. Almost instantly, the IMF reacted. They accused Ghana of manipulating its own currency, of breaking the invisible rules of the financial empire. But in the streets of Accra, no one cared what the IMF said. What mattered was that bread stopped doubling in price overnight. What mattered was that for the first time in years, the government acted not for foreign creditors, but for its own people. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Ouagadougou, a young soldier-turned-president was preparing a shock of his own. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had already electrified Africa by defying France and demanding sovereignty. But in January, he went further. Standing before his cabinet, he announced the nationalization of Burkina Faso's gold sector. No more contracts tilted in favor of Canadian mining companies. No more billions extracted while Burkinabe villages remained poor. From now on, the profits would go directly into the national treasury. The symbolism was explosive. Gold has always been Africa's curse, and its crown mined by outsiders, enriching everyone except those who lived on the land. By seizing control, Traoré was not just rewriting a policy, he was rewriting history. And then came the spark: Ghana and Burkina Faso, two countries facing different struggles, but driven by the same fire, appeared to be moving in sync. One defended its currency without IMF approval, the other reclaimed its gold without asking foreign permission. To the world's financial elite, this was a nightmare scenario. Because if one African nation dares to act, the IMF can punish. But if two act at the same time, if others begin to follow, the old system starts to crack. And suddenly, the whispers grew louder. Nigeria, Mali, Niger, could they be next? The IMF issued warnings. Western media outlets called these moves reckless and dangerous. But inside Africa, the story was different. In the radio stations of Tamale, the cafes of Ouagadougou, the WhatsApp groups stretching from Dakar to Johannesburg, a new phrase kept repeating: "We are not waiting anymore." This was the essence of the shock. Not just a technical maneuver in foreign exchange markets or a mining contract on paper. It was the spirit of defiance made real in action. Ghana and Burkina Faso, two nations long treated as pawns on the global chessboard, had just made their own move without asking, without apologizing. And for the IMF, an institution built on the assumption of obedience, this was the one thing they had never prepared for. The warnings came fast. Within days of Ghana's bold intervention, IMF officials issued carefully worded statements. They spoke of risks to regional stability, of unsustainable policies, of the dangers of currency manipulation. But behind the diplomatic language was a simple message: Ghana, you have crossed a red line. Yet on the ground, something extraordinary happened. In Accra's crowded Makola market, women who sold vegetables began to notice that prices had finally stopped doubling. Taxi drivers returned to the streets, filling their tanks with fuel that, while still expensive, no longer threatened to bankrupt them after one shift. For the first time in months, there was a sense of relief. Ordinary people didn't care about the IMF's spreadsheets. They cared that the government was fighting for them. And then across the border in Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré delivered the line that would echo across the continent. "We are not poor. We are being robbed." It was more than a policy announcement. It was a rallying cry. Clips of his speech spread like wildfire across social media. In WhatsApp groups from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, people forwarded the video, adding comments like, "This is the leader Africa has been waiting for." The reaction was immediate and emotional. In Ouagadougou, crowds gathered outside government buildings, chanting Traoré's name. In Accra, radio hosts compared Ghana's currency defense to Burkina Faso's gold revolution, calling it a double strike against the empire. Suddenly, two nations that rarely shared headlines were seen as partners in a continental rebellion. The IMF scrambled to regain control of the narrative. Western newspapers branded the moves as reckless populism. Analysts on TV warned that Ghana and Burkina Faso were risking collapse. But the more they attacked, the stronger the defiance grew. It was as if every criticism from abroad only fed the fire at home. Politicians in other African capitals were watching closely. In Nigeria, lawmakers quietly debated whether defending the naira outside IMF rules might be possible. In Mali and Niger, already aligned with Burkina Faso through the AS alliance, officials publicly praised Traoré's courage. Even in South Africa, some opposition leaders began to ask, why do we keep bowing to institutions that never bow to us? This was the IMF's nightmare. One nation acting alone could be punished, currency devalued, aid withheld, sanctions imposed. But two nations in different corners of West Africa breaking free at the same time, that looked less like rebellion and more like the first tremors of a movement. The tension built to a crescendo when international financial media published leaked reports claiming the IMF was considering suspending negotiations with Ghana. Instead of panic, the news fueled anger. On the streets, people asked, why should we beg them at all? Why must we starve to satisfy their conditions? The IMF, for the first time in decades, found itself not feared, but openly ridiculed. And then came the symbolism no one could ignore. As Ghana defended its currency and Burkina Faso seized its gold ordinary, Africans began to speak of a new kind of wealth, not measured in dollars or euros, but in dignity. For them, this was no longer just about economics. It was about sovereignty. It was about finally saying no to a system that had treated Africa as a colony long after independence. Western governments grew uneasy. U.S. diplomats privately warned of dangerous precedents. European envoys whispered about regional instability. But in the streets of Accra and Ouagadougou, the people had already decided this was not instability. This was liberation. The climax came when Traoré and Ghana's central bankers were both quoted on the same day, one saying, "Africa must reclaim its resources," the other insisting Ghana would not stop defending the cedi. For the first time, two separate voices created a single message: Africa will not wait for permission. And in that moment, the IMF's shock turned to something more dangerous: fear. Fear that this was not an isolated storm, but the beginning of a continent-wide hurricane. Fear that Ghana and Burkina Faso had lit a fire others could not put out. Fear that the rules of global finance written in Washington and Paris were about to be rewritten in Accra and Ouagadougou. The world had seen defiance before. But this felt different. This felt irreversible. When the dust settled after Ghana's currency defense and Burkina Faso's gold nationalization, the impact rippled far beyond the headlines. For ordinary citizens, these moves were not abstract policy shifts. They were lifelines, tangible signs that for once their leaders were fighting for them rather than bowing to unseen masters. In Ghana, the immediate relief was felt in kitchens and marketplaces. Tomatoes and onions no longer doubled in price week to week. A teacher in Kumasi described how her family could finally afford 3 meals a day again, even if modest. Taxi drivers in Accra said they could fill their tanks without fearing bankruptcy. The message was clear: the government had broken with tradition, refusing to let its people starve while waiting for IMF approval. For the first time in years, citizens felt their government was on their side. In Burkina Faso, the reaction was even more visceral. When Traore announced that the profits from gold would now flow into the national treasury, villagers across mining regions erupted in celebration. In towns long scarred by exploitation, people spoke of hope that schools, clinics, and clean water might finally arrive. For many, it was not just about gold, it was about dignity. The very idea that a young president could defy international corporations and claim resources for his own people electrified the national spirit. But these changes also carried profound political consequences. In both nations, public trust surged. Opinion polls in Ghana showed a sharp spike in approval for the central bank and government, even among citizens who had long been skeptical. In Burkina Faso, Traore's popularity reached unprecedented levels. Crowds filled stadiums and streets chanting his name, comparing him to Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary hero who decades earlier dreamed of the same sovereignty now being reborn. At the same time, opposition voices grew quieter. Politicians who once argued for compliance with IMF conditions found themselves on the defensive, accused of defending foreign interests over their own people. Civil society groups, student unions, and labor organizations increasingly framed their activism around sovereignty and independence, echoing the moves of Ghana and Burkina Faso. Yet not all consequences were positive. The IMF's warnings began to sow uncertainty among local elites and business leaders who relied on international approval. Investors worried about long-term stability. Western-leaning politicians accused Traore and Ghana's central bank of playing with fire. Some even warned of sanctions or aid suspensions that could push their nations into isolation. The stage was set for a deepening confrontation, not just between nations and the IMF, but within the political systems of Ghana and Burkina Faso themselves. Still on the streets, the mood was unshakable. In marketplaces, on university campuses, in mosques and churches, the refrain was the same: we are not poor, we are being robbed. That phrase, born in Ouagadougou, had become a continental mantra. For millions of ordinary Africans, it was no longer just Traore's voice, it was their own. This wave of public sentiment began to pressure leaders in neighboring countries. In Niger and Mali, members of the ruling juntas praised Traore openly, while hinting they too might reconsider contracts with foreign companies. In Nigeria, opposition parties began to question the government's reliance on IMF loans. Even in East Africa, whispers emerged: if Ghana and Burkina Faso can do it, why not us? The IMF had not simply been shocked, it had been politically weakened. For decades, its power rested on the assumption that African leaders would always choose obedience over resistance. But now obedience looked like betrayal, while defiance looked like leadership. This was the real political earthquake, the redefining of what it meant to govern. No longer was a responsible leader the one who satisfied Washington and Brussels. A responsible leader in the eyes of the people was now the one who dared to break free. And in this new reality, the IMF was not just battling governments, it was battling the will of the people. In Washington, the mood was uneasy. The U.S. Treasury and State Department, long accustomed to African governments falling in line with IMF dictates, suddenly found themselves facing an uncomfortable precedent. If Ghana and Burkina Faso could defy the rules and survive, what would stop Nigeria, South Africa, or Kenya from following? For decades, the IMF had been America's most reliable instrument of influence on the continent. Now that instrument was slipping. American analysts appeared on television warning of serious risks. They argued that Ghana's currency defense was unsustainable, that Burkina Faso's nationalization would scare away investors. But beneath the rhetoric was a deeper fear that Africa was learning to live without permission from Washington. For the U.S., this was not just about economics. It was about geopolitics, about control, about the balance of global power. In Europe, the reaction was equally divided. French officials were furious at Traore's gold reforms, seeing them as a direct attack on France's historic influence in West Africa. Brussels feared that a wave of copycat policies could destabilize European trade ties across the continent. Yet some European commentators admitted quietly that perhaps Africa had a point. How long, one German economist asked, can we continue to demand austerity from countries that have been looted for centuries? Meanwhile, in Moscow and Beijing, silence spoke louder than words. Russia and China did not issue official statements, but their media outlets covered Ghana and Burkina Faso with fascination and approval. Analysts speculated that both powers saw opportunity. For Russia, closer ties with the AES alliance meant weakening Western military and financial dominance. For China, the chance to build financial partnerships outside IMF structures aligned perfectly with its Belt and Road ambitions. The West saw rebellion. Moscow and Beijing saw potential allies. Across the global South, the story resonated even more strongly. In Latin America, commentators recalled their own battles with the IMF during the debt crises of the 1980s and 1990s. In Asia, activists drew parallels to Indonesia and Thailand's struggles under IMF restructuring. For many, Ghana and Burkina Faso were not outliers. They were pioneers giving voice to frustrations shared by much of the developing world. The global financial markets, however, reacted cautiously. Investors fretted about risk, but also began to hedge bets, exploring whether African countries could establish parallel financial frameworks. Some speculated about the rise of a new African monetary bloc anchored not in Washington, but in Accra, Ouagadougou, and Bamako. For the first time in decades, the narrative was shifting. The IMF was no longer seen as the sole arbiter of financial stability. It was being painted as a relic of colonial control. And while the US and Europe still wielded immense power, the very fact that Ghana and Burkina Faso had dared to say no without immediate collapse planted a dangerous seed, the idea that Africa could chart its own path. This was the true global consequence. Not a single policy decision, not even the temporary stabilization of a currency or the nationalization of a mine. The consequence was psychological. The illusion of inevitability, the belief that Africa must always obey, had been broken. And once an illusion breaks, it cannot easily be restored. My friends, what we are witnessing is more than a financial dispute. It is the opening act of a struggle that could redefine Africa's place in the world. For decades, the IMF has operated like an invisible empire, deciding the fate of nations, dictating policies from afar, and demanding obedience in exchange for survival. But today, that empire has been challenged. Ghana's defense of its currency and Traore's bold nationalization of gold are not isolated acts. They are signals loud and clear that Africa will no longer accept chains dressed as contracts or poverty disguised as structural adjustment. These moves have already changed the psychology of an entire continent. People now know there is another way, and that knowledge is more dangerous to the old order than any economic reform. But with opportunity comes danger. History tells us that no empire gives up power willingly. The West will not simply watch as Africa breaks free. Sanctions, destabilization, political pressure, all of these tools may be unleashed. Ghana and Burkina Faso may face storms far greater than inflation or market speculation. The question is not whether the pressure will come, it is whether the people united behind their leaders can withstand it. And here lies the warning: if Africa hesitates, if it allows itself to be divided, once more the IMF will regain control stronger than before. But if Africa stands together, if nations from Accra to Ouagadougou, from Lagos to Nairobi speak with one voice, then this moment will not be a footnote. It will be the turning point. So I ask you, what future do you want to see? A continent forever waiting for permission, or a continent writing its own destiny? The answer begins with awareness. It begins with refusing to stay silent. Share this story. Talk about it with your friends and family. Let the world know that Africa is no longer begging, it is building. Ghana has acted. Traore has acted. And now the choice rests with all of us, because history is watching. And the question it will ask one day is simple: when the moment came, did Africa rise or did it fall back into silence?